Great. Well, I think this session raised lots of really fundamental questions about the archive, but maybe it's useful to work out how much, before we start, with a kind of the same question to everybody, how much this discussion relates to archives of women's work and how much to archives in general. And it'd be really useful to hear from those among us who also have responsibilities for archives. Because generally, as we all know, photo archives have received really patchy treatment over the last 50 years. To my knowledge, they've been treasured, they've been thrown away, they've been damaged, they've been over-edited. All sorts of things have happened to photo archives. So do women's photo archives get the same treatment as men's? I mean, I'm sure the Joe Spence archive, Charlene, I'm sure you would be a very good person to maybe start off with that.
Yeah, it's initially when you ask that question, I think about how I thought about this call for papers, which really was, the archive of Joe Spence did come to Ryerson over a lot of years in 3 big shipments, and it really was it still is quite messy to try to sort out. It has been 20 years of Terry Dennett's hands in there, so it's tough to sort through it all, but interesting. And I thought to myself, when I saw the call for this paper, for this conference, that women in photography, first of all, there needs to be a place in the collections for women's photography. And so for me, looking at the Joe Spence archive being so spread out and in such a state of disarray, I really wanted to focus on, do we need this category of women in photography in the past? Do we still need it? I think we need to secure the places in the collections first to even begin to understand that. So that was my sort of departure point into this. If I can answer, I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer the question really precisely if, women's archives, I'm not sure if the Spence archive was treated differently. I have a lot of Bernie Savitt's collection too, and it is also the ephemera, not the stuff that's been exhibited over years and years. The ephemera is pretty messy too, so I'm not sure. I don't really know if I have a really well-organized women's archive to really compare against. I have lots of mess. So,
and just a little sub-question before we get on to everybody else, or a sub-point, is that Terry Dennett's personality is obviously woven into the archive you have, but can you kind of explain just really quickly the difference between the Joe Spence archive and the Joe Spence Memorial Archive, and the position that Terry Dennett kind of plays in, the role he plays in all of those?
Yep. The Joe Spence Memorial Archive was established after Joe died, to be continued, and there's correspondence that state this, to be continued as the photography workshop did, to provide access, to maintain, to keep conversation going. So it has been dispersed now. I mean, all the books have now gone to Birkbeck. We have a lot in our collection. Stuff has been sold here. So this cohesive Joe Spence Memorial Archive is dispersed now. Ours is called simply the Joe Spence Archive, which I'm not even sure it should be called that, to be honest with you, because there really is activity in there for 20 years that I'm constantly coming up against. There's checklists that say, I'll send you this, I'll send you this file, you just print it, put it in your collection. It's really exploded over 20 years. So for me, it's about really tracing Terry Dennett's activity in that as well. So the Joe Spence Memorial Archive, I would say, is really no longer, but we need Joe Spence in the history. So for me, that's what this project is about. Creating, I would love a union catalog across public institutions. I would love to talk to other people how they're cataloging, what their records reflect, context, all that stuff. So I think for me, that's the big difference. I actually made our web people change it from Joe Spence Memorial Archive to just Joe Spence Archive, because it is different now, which is not a bad thing, I don't think, but it's definitely like, I'm running a lot, trying to make sure where is everything, but it's exciting, so. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, okay.
And Jean?
The archive. I said to Val earlier, down with the archive, because there's so much of it. And I was very struck by some of your images of that wonderful chaos, which isn't chaos really, because everything was filed, but you get a wonderful sense of all those different times and any archives like that. And that's what you come up against. Now, your question about women, and particularly for me, voice, there are artists in this audience whose voices I have in my archive. And so one of the issues is always, what do you take out? And then what happens is, it's like a terrible addiction. You start listening, you think, oh, that's interesting. Oh, no, that's interesting as well. Oh, what about that? Oh, they've said that. And your brain starts going in all kinds of different directions. So is it difference between, you know, a male archive? I was struck by how many voices I had, but there is a different intimacy. I would say, from my experience, that although some of the 60s male artists, and I have talked to a lot of those, they tend to tell me quite a lot of things. Women also have a very particular way, not in general, but there is a kind of a wonderful kind of warmth, and there's something very special there in the voice, in those moments. I've spoken to people, you know, when they've said, oh God, I can't make work because, you know, my kid is crying all the time, or something like that. Now, that raises a question, doesn't it? I'm not sure that I've ever heard that from a male artist who said that. But there are other things as well. I mean, it raises for me so many questions of identifying yourself. In general as well, and it's a huge generalization, the people I've interviewed men have been less worried about sounding stupid. Now, for me, that's rather important because I feel I sound stupid most of the time. And I kind of really empathise with that how you talk, and you don't want it to go out there and you've tripped over your words or said something silly or mispronounced something. I don't know whether, so it's not really an answer, it's really a question about how do we relate to different genders, whether it be the voice, whether it be the archive, whether all the things we collect. And as I say, it is an addiction. You start to get interested in something and you collect more and more. And there was another slide you showed that particularly fascinated me. I think it was the slide you showed anyway, which had a kind of bit of a coffee stain, or there was a stain on it. I love that, you know, there's stains that, you know, you put it down, so, oh God, someone's put a cup of coffee on it. Oh well, never mind. They've ruined it. And the only reason I mention that is because when I was lending something to an exhibition, I said, well, I have got that book, but the cover's all, you know, I spilt something on it and someone's torn the corner off to make a roach or something way back when, you know, and it's a bit of a mess. And he said, oh no, I want bring it on. So anyway, yes, don't think I've answered the question, but
that's great.
The archive.
Well, it's funny, I'm just thinking now about the ephemera from Abbott too was under the stewardship of Ron Kurtz. So I'm thinking maybe the stuff comes in such a mess because it was left with, you know, men for so long. Anyway.
So what about you, Sarah? Because your archive, you know, the gender of it, I suppose you could say it was ambiguous. Could you, or wouldn't you say that?
Well, I'm not sure really how to answer this, because I suppose I see the archive as being a family archive. The story that I'm taking out is very much about this person, Ken or Kay, and in that sense I think it probably is ambiguous. Because on the one hand you've got the family photograph albums from which Kay is absent but Ken is present, and then you've got all the archive material, the papers, the letters, the documents, in which Kay is very present. So I really don't know how to answer it in terms of being a gendered archive. I just think of it as a family archive.
But I suppose as a woman artist, you're making a new archive, that's the complexity of this project, isn't it?
And in that context, I would say it's very definitely has a gender, and it's as a woman that I'm making that archive. And it's as a woman that I respond to the material in the family archive. And the decisions I make, obviously, come from who I am and where I am as a woman. Yeah.
I want to relate a little story about Homai when I first met her, because when I first went to meet her in 1997, that was when I was making a film about her. And I saw this little news item on the television about her, and I didn't even know that she existed. And I landed up at her house. She was cooking, and she had this, she had been making these little negative jackets for her. She had 120 negatives because she was basically shot on the speed graphic and the Rolleiflex, the medium format camera. And so there was this pile of negative jackets lying there. She had very painstakingly made these little negative jackets. And all that was lying right next to the stove where she was cooking. She was a single woman, so she lived solo. She had lost her husband. She had lost her son when I met her. And I think that kind of, for me, is a metaphor for the kind of life that she lived, where I think you talked about, the person not wanting to be concerned with the everydayness of feminine living. And Homai was somebody who actually straddled both worlds quite effortlessly. So she talks about how, for instance, when she developed, her film, people would say, but don't you measure? And she said, I do it like I do it in the kitchen. I just throw in a little bit of developer, etc. Now, having said that, she was actually her own archivist. So in her case, nobody in India would have archived her work had it not been for this meticulous woman putting away her archive. In India, the situation is slightly different. I think it would be similar for men and women. There's a particular part of photo history that has not actually, India doesn't have good traditions of archiving at all. Colonial photography has been immaculately archived, but that's because of the British Library and the OIOC collection and so on and so forth. So we've got colonial photography that's all out there, and we've had reams and reams and reams of work on colonial photography. But anything after 1947, there's almost no work. I think my book was probably the first book to talk about a period of photography after let's say, the British Empire. And so that lack or that kind of inattention to archiving runs across photographers, whether they are men or women. So nobody received any attention. Then there was this double burden of somebody who was a press photographer. In India, press photographers didn't even get bylines for many years. Mm-hmm. So if your pictures were published in a magazine or a newspaper, you didn't even get a byline for that. So there was no way that sometimes even authorship is difficult because many of them, there are incredible stories of collaboration. I found this picture in her archive of the swearing-in ceremony, and she had in an interview said to me, I wasn't inside during the swearing-in ceremony because a man outside got into a fight with me and said, you work for the British Information Services and I'm not going to let you in because today India gets independent. And she had this furious fight with this man and he wouldn't let her in. So I said, but how do you have the photograph? She said, but we always traded pictures. There was somebody in and he said he'll give me one picture and I gave him one picture. And so, but they were different days when authorship, they would do these things. So there was this kind of spirit of collaboration, but again, they didn't get that kind of credit. So I think that in her case, the archive comes to us because of her efforts to kind of keep her archive. I mean, just the fact that she'd keep, and I want to describe the way she had kept her negatives. She had put all her favorite negatives in a big Tupperware box. So she had this big steel cupboard, and if you opened the steel cupboard, there was a big Tupperware box which had what she considered her important negatives. And then there was prints underneath the bed, and they were tightly packed because Baroda has very humid weather. These are black and white images. They would have faded away. So she would, very tightly pack them together in newspaper. They were put in shoe boxes, in Kodak boxes. They were in, and then there were these 100 negatives of 100, 100 negative jackets of 100 negatives each in that wooden chest of drawers, in the open with her toolbox lying in a corner. All the 10 years that I knew her, I never got to see any of that because those were analog times when I didn't even have the resources to open up those negatives. So it's only when her archive actually was given away to the private archive in 2010 that they had the resources to actually digitize, that we were actually opening up stuff that we had never seen before. But other than that, I was kind of dependent on the stuff that she had actually identified as her important pictures. So I sometimes wonder what she would have to say about some of these pictures. For instance, the picture that I showed, of the man impersonating as a woman. Now, I think it's an incredibly contemporary picture today. But I wonder what Homai I think she'd be very pleasantly surprised. She was always very open to stuff that you took out for her. And she'd say, you think this is important? She never wanted you not to show it. But she'd always say, do you think this is important? Do you think this is as important as Nehru and Gandhi? And I'd say, Mrs. Vyarawala, I always called her Mrs. Vyarawala. I said, Mrs. Vyarawala, this is very important. And so we pull it out. But it would be interesting to see that. But to directly answer your question, I think in India, erasure worked for both men and women. So I don't know. I would be a little uncomfortable with a very essentialist argument about this whole business of men and women. I would be slightly uncomfortable with that.
Right. I think this might be a really good point to open up. We can go back to some more specific questions, but I don't know whether our microphone people are here yet. Oh, you are. Great. I mean, because I know there are people here who have a real interest in archives and who look after them. And I just wonder if we might open it up and we might have some views or some questions. I've got one already.
This is, hello, can you hear me? Yeah. This is more just a reflection on the archive because I'm a living artist. I have a living archive. It takes a lot of time and money to organize it. It means that when you're archiving your work constantly, you're also slowing down your contemporary work. It's really having the means. And the successful archives, I guess, one looks at are one like Martin Parr, who's had the means to create a vast archive, which includes the museification of all of his ephemera. I don't think I know anybody who's done it to that extent. I don't think Cartier-Bresson, definitely that generation didn't do it. It was done by someone else. But, I think Martin Parr is quite an interesting case study. And also Martha Rosler, for example, and her library. And it is about resources and economics, really, I think, in the last instance, actually.
Yeah. And just to respond to you, Karen, I mean, Homai, for instance, comes from a very ordinary, not even middle class. I mean, her background, she's often said that if her boyfriend wasn't a photographer, maybe she would have done something else. It was imperative that she worked. And she met her boyfriend. He was a photographer, self-taught photographer. She learned photography. She turned out to be an incredible photographer. He ended up being the darkroom guy, and she ended up being the photographer. They worked in the same place. But her background was such that there was no way that she would have had the means to archive her work. But what is interesting is the way in which the archive's coming back. So there's one part of the archive is what is there in the private archive. Then there are all these pictures of ordinary people that she gave away. And now we have people coming back to me and saying, here's a Homai Vyarawala picture. I'd like to return it to you. So that's an interesting way in which people are coming back now. Now that Homai is becoming visible and well known, people are coming back with their own pictures that Homai probably doesn't even have negatives of.
In the middle there.
I've got two questions, one kind of very specific and then one more general. Charlene, I really enjoyed your paper, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the role of Richard Salton Gallery, because they've been sort of representing the estates of quite a few important feminist artists, and I actually feel quite ambivalent about that. I don't know the gallery personally, but just kind of, where these kind of archives end up and how they're sort of split up. Like sometimes that's useful, like Jo Spence was very pragmatic, I think, about how her archive would be used. I'd just be interested on your comments. And then more generally to the panel, what do they think would constitute a feminist practice of archiving? Because it's something that I think is kind of more important maybe than a male or a female archive. Because Jo Spence, for me, is a really important example of someone who had a politicised feminist practice of archiving and using her archiving for teaching, and in a very kind of dynamic way. That is one of the reasons why it's still so kind of alive today.
To answer your first question about Richard Saltoun, I'm more in the same position as you, as I see who he represents from afar. I have actually only spoke with him for about 2 minutes in my life, last November when I came here to pick up about 30 boxes, banker's boxes of stuff. Dennett's vision is not that great. There are reasons why he's passed it off. So that that's kind of the best answer I can really give you for that. I don't really have anything else to say except it's really a pragmatic reason why he has looked for representation. I think your second question being feminist practice as an archivist, I think for me that means really representing what Joe was doing. It was a lot of collaboration. It was, and representing those names. Like I said in my paper, Joe Spence as a singular name is kind of not true to like the Picture of Health or the Hackney Flashers or the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really doing my best to make sure that's reflected in the records, make sure it's reflected in how we write about it and think about it. So I'm actually in this room today building a lot of new relationships with people that I only see their name, So it's nice to put faces. So for me, I think that is my feminist practice, is to just sort of give stewardship to the collection at the Ryerson Image Center, the way that the work was made, essentially as a teaching collection. I mean, the other day I sat at my desk with a student in Vid Ingleviks's class who was interested in doing some work that related to Joe, and we sat down at my computer for an hour and a half and just looked through thumbnails, and I said, this is Joe Spence, so, think about this. And so it is starting to come to a place where, it's starting to come to a place that feels good, I think. The bubble wrap is gone, and I'm getting into the real work, so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, for the second part of the question, Jean.
Okay. I think that is really, as you were saying that, I was thinking, okay, feminist, what constitutes a feminist practice? And in relationship to the voice, that's interesting as well. I want to preface this by saying that, linking a little bit with Karen Knorr's question about money and finances to do things. Archives need preserving, and certainly with older archives, tapes, that need transferring, things like that takes time. I would say that when I was looking through for this talk, there were people I really, really wanted to put in, and then I looked and thought, oh no, they're on a DAT thing. I'm going to have to put the DAT onto the machine. It's going to take ages. And then I've got to edit it, and then I've got to do this. I have interviewed many artists I would consider to be pretty much have a feminist practice. Many of them actually were kind of associated with Warhol's factory, so quite a few of them, for example, people who were in Warhol's films, who I would say had a pretty feminist practice, Bridget Berlin being one, and she's very subversive when you record her. So she tries to subvert the recording, which is kind of pretty cool actually, but it also doesn't make much sense if you're playing it unless you do a big explanation of what she's doing. So she got one recording I did with her, she just got her dog to bark into the recording. On another one, she said, oh, I'm going to make you a tit painting, and shouted it into the recording. Now, unfortunately, that's another one which was particularly funny, which was from 1995, which was on one of those little, what were those little ones you used, almost tiny little tapes? I can't remember what they were called now. You know, those little ones you used to, like dictaphone. She said, I don't want to do the interview in my apartment. Let's do it on the street. I'm going to tell you all about Andy Warhol. And she waited until like a fire truck came by, and she'd go, you couldn't hear a thing. So I think that's a kind of pretty feminist way of dealing. You know, she was taking back the control that she felt he had had on her life, and she was damned if she was going to give it away to my recorder. Other ones, Jenny Holzer, actually talking about technology, but she was really talking about film more than, so I didn't use her today. And then other ones were an early recording with Sam Taylor Wood, now Sam Taylor Johnson, where she was talking about working with people, you know, really taking them to the edge. And that was interesting as well. And that continued into a discussion when she made later work called Crying Men. And that was really fascinating because we had this conversation where it became batted between, she said, these actors, you know, you think they'd be able to cry, but actually, you know, it was a bit difficult to get some of them to cry. And then we were discussing about how, you know, all the strategies for how do you get tears to come out of your eyes. So there's different ways that you might, you know, none of those in themselves constitute a feminist practice, and you can be a feminist, but you might not give a feminist recording at that particular moment in time. But often it's when you're trying to reclaim something, or somebody is saying, no, actually, for years people have saying I made the work like this, and do you know what? That's wrong. And so things like that, but trying to pick all those little bits out for the purposes of this was impossible. But one day, it will all be digitised, and I can just go, you're wrong, and it'll all come up on a screen, and we'll be able to listen to it. Maybe.
Thanks. Sarah?
Well, I think that was a very interesting question. And I mean, I would certainly say that my work's underpinned with a feminist practice, but I'm not really sure what a feminist practice in terms of an archive would look like. I mean, I'd like to ask you what you have in mind in terms of a feminist practice in terms of an archive. I mean,
We need the mic back, I think.
Do you
Do
not
we
have
have
the
the
mic
mic
still?
back? It's just down about 5 rows from the front.
Because it's a really interesting question.
Well, I don't have a specific answer, but I think one of the questions sort of raised by this conference, Women and Photography, one of sort of under that rubric must be what a feminist approach to a history of women in photography is, because I think most of us would understand that it's no longer just enough just to insert women back into the history of photography, and so a feminist archival practice might be about trying to kind of bring to life those histories that haven't been told, how to communicate them to them. I mean, your project, I mean, allowing Kay's voice to come to us in a way that, you know, it's very difficult how to do that, you know, sort of mediated through your mother and your aunt's letters, but like his or her voice and how that comes through. So I guess I'm sort of, today it's been a lot about kind of photographers who've either been lost or overlooked or have decided to remove themselves. So just the idea of who's a successful woman photographer, who is visible for us to archive, who should we go and find? I mean, these are questions that, as an art historian, I find are really, really interesting. And you know, there is this wealth of history around women in photography, but what we do with that is something to ask, because we don't have to follow archival practices as they have been instituted, and all the work, particularly on sort of queer archives of feelings, I think Joe Spence would really, you know, sort of feel a great affinity to. So, you know, just sort of what we find within the archive as, well, I'm speaking as a feminist, but, you know, what one might find as a feminist rather than necessarily a woman, I think is an important question.
Great, thank you.
Would you like to?
No, I think
Can
that's
I
great.
respond to that? I'd like to talk a little bit about my own relationship with Homai, which I think is part of my feminist practice. I think that if I were to use the F word with Homai, she comes from a generation where she'd say, what is this feminism, you know? But I do think she was a feminist. And so, you know, I think we had a shared, I'm a single woman, she was a single woman. When we met, you know, we had a kind of a bonding. But I think that my style of working with her, or my way of working with her, was, I don't think that it was easy for me to separate Homai as a subject from Homai as a person I dearly loved, who was my friend, who was my confidant. And I think that for me is part of my feminism. So it couldn't be a cut and dry relationship. So I went to make my film with her. I came back. There was no funding for a book, but I was determined that I had given her 18 minutes in a film with 3 women photographers. There were 2 other women, and I said to myself, this is ridiculous. I cannot have her, have 18 minutes in a film. I have to document her life. I didn't know that I was going to be funded for a book. I went back every 3 months to interview her, to talk to her. I'd stay with her, or I'd stay away. And staying with her meant, you have to remember when I met her, she was 87. She didn't have the energy to speak endlessly. So she would speak, we would cook, she would cook for me, she would sleep, I would sleep, we would wake up. The pace had to be different. And now I look back with so much of affection and nostalgia for that time, because I don't even realize how therapeutic that was for me every time I went there, because suddenly my pace of this mad pace, frenetic pace of working in a city came to a standstill because I was with a 90-year-old woman. And it was this whole business of going with her to the nursery to buy a plant. And then when we would sit down, we'd have tea, and then we'd start talking. And sometimes the conversations were about photographs. And then from photography, it would go into life. And then it would go up, we would talk about her relationship with people. But it all finally comes back into the book. It all comes back into my work. So I don't feel that any of that wandering, there was this wandering quality to my archiving, if I can call it that, those taped interviews. That wandering quality is what I see as a feminist approach, because I think that I don't want to fall into essentialist categories and say that a man can't do that, but I'm just saying that I learned that from Homai, this whole business of being patient, for waiting. She would say, I'd say, how is it to work with so many men? And she'd say, I just wait patiently. I'd let all the men push each other and take their pictures. And then I would just step forward when they'd all taken their picture, and I'd go out and I'd get that picture. And she'd get the best picture because they'd look at her because she was the only woman. So the thing is that maybe those are lessons to be learned from Homai, who wouldn't call herself a feminist, but I thought she was a feminist.
Sarah, did you want to come back?
No?
Okay. So next, we've got one on the right. That's it. I think. Sorry if I've missed anybody out.
I'd like to thank all 4 women on the panel for presenting what I think is quite a meaty section of this whole conference. What I think is quite interesting to pick up on, I was really excited by the female voice from Eugene, because I don't know if you've heard when Lisa Jardine died a few weeks ago, did you hear her comment on the female voice? Because I thought it sums up what she was saying about. And one of the things she said, she gives all her students a tip when they go into any spaces where they're in the minority or there are lots of men, is to let your voice be the first to be heard. And she said, even if it means just asking for a glass of water, just let your voice, because she said the female voice is discordant, it's higher, it unsettles men. And they need to hear it and then pitch it, and then they'll listen. And I just thought that was an interesting way to deal with being in a minority within a bigger space, to let your voice be the first in the room. So I think it's a tip I should constantly hold on to for all minority situations. Let my voice be the first in the room. Another thing I find was interesting was when I was listening to Charlene, when you were talking about the chaos of the archive in terms of Jo, and Jo's another person I also was privileged to have met during her working life. And I think with archives, why shouldn't it be chaotic? Because not only is the chaos allow it to be fresh each time you find something, and there's for the longevity of it and the interest of it. And I think for the idea of Martin Parr having an archive that is up to date, and when he pops it, we've all seen the work and have all discussed the work and we all know where it was coming from. I think it's fine on one level, but I like the idea of an archive being exactly what it is, chaos, and the afterlife. After I've passed on, everyone else can go and dig deep and find hidden treasures and so on. And that takes me into another discussion about the responsibility of the archivist or of the person who's going to portray that work to a future generation and stuff. People like Humai Virawala and Jo Spence, both people I knew, were very strong women with specific ideas about their work, themselves, their position. They were not unsure of themselves within the frame. Therefore, when somebody else misinterprets the work or read another level of it, I think that's all very well. Each person brings a new reading, but I think somewhere within the discourse, within the diction, or within any written text, one has to remember the original interpretation by the artists, who were vociferous and strong women, and I think they have to be remembered for what they originally set out, even if they were hiding, even if they were misinterpreting their work. Whatever they did, that is a respect to that work, to be left whatever they interpret it as. And the new reading is for the next generation.
Next one.
I was thinking about what you were saying about Hanai and taking photographs and then you finding them in her archive and then saying, this is not important. Do you really think it's important? And thinking about what you were saying about Martin Parr having a really great archive already. And I was just wondering, before obviously thinking about Hanai, when she was photographing, being the only woman doing what she was doing, probably was not aware that a lot of her stuff would be seen. I wonder if now what you thought about how, now that there are more women, now that we are being seen and heard, if you think that affects our practice or could affect the practice and the way the particular types of photographs that are taken. And yeah, I guess just because if you have an awareness that it's going to be seen by the world, specifically, especially with the internet and digital age, if that would affect the kind of work you produce and what you thought about that.
Should I respond? Yeah. Was that a question for me?
Right, okay. Everybody from you onwards.
Okay. Yeah, just a quick response to both Monica and to you. You know, Homai, as a person, had very fixed ideas about her work, but she was also one of the most open people that I know. So having known her for 15 years, I also know that when I would take her pictures, and that process, Monica had actually started with the exhibitions in 2010-11 when we were starting to open up. And we had already started to open up, and there was a sense of delight, I have to say, a secret sense of delight when she would come and she'd look bewildered and she'd say, are you sure that we should have the political section so small and we should have so much of this other stuff? But there was also a sense of delight when people would come up and say, wow, what lovely pictures. So, you know, it was also a sense of, I think it's also that question that was raised in the morning about what time is it when the pictures, 1997, when Sati Sharma first found the pictures as the photographer who first discovered her, it was a moment of commemoration. Yeah. Political pictures were the most important thing in the country. It's a different moment today. She's known, she's up there, she's already there, she's established her position there as somebody who was this important chronicler of Indian independence. But I think she'd be very pleased, I think, at some of the new stuff that's coming out today. And as far as keeping her confidences go, I think that would always be safe with me. I mean, there are things that she said to me which are very personal things that obviously will never be in the public domain, because that's something that I will keep the same. I mean, those are things that I've learned from Homai about the dignity of her subjects, and I would never, ever betray that trust. But coming to the question about, I think you said something about new work coming out today. You talked about the internet. You know, I don't think that we have any control over that, because these pictures are now out in the digital domain. For this presentation, I just happened to, go onto the internet, and I suddenly saw all Homai's pictures in these terrible blogs, which are attacking, because you have to remember that today India has a right-wing government, a terrible fascist right-wing government right now. And we have a lot of attacks. I mean, I'm not a Congress supporter, but we have a lot of attacks on the Nehru family, the Gandhi family. And there are these terrible blogs kind of taking off on Jawaharlal Nehru. And so many of them are to do with his supposed dalliances with women. And so many of Homai's photographs are being used in these terrible blogs, you know, calling him names and abusing him and all of that. But at the end of the day, that's the digital domain. That's the domain that we live with. There's no control. So there is only so much that you will be able to control. So there are always going to be different kinds of authors of those images.
Sarah, thank you.
I'm very interested in what both people were saying and then also asking, because I do think that as a photographer, your voice is very important and your perspective, always. And so I agree with what you're saying there, but there's something else that I also want to say, which is that with the Can to Be Destroyed project, what's been happening since I first began to work with it in 2013 is that since Val and I started to work together on the book, it's taken on a different life as a project that's in this book. And that's been because of collaborating with Val, which has been amazing. And I've always, in my practice, before working on this project, I collaborated with people that I was taking photographs of, which was very important because I was aware that as a photographer, I had power and I was wanting to make an image. That came out in some of the talks today in different ways. But I always tried really hard to work with the person, so the person I was photographing, their voice could come out. And I think as a photographer, you're never entirely alone in what you're doing in that sense, particularly if you are working in any way with other people, or if you're collaborating in terms of taking photographs. And I'm very appreciative of that process. I really love the outside viewpoints that I got in my previous work with working with other people, learning about their lives and their experiences and how they saw themselves, which wasn't how I saw them, and the photographs that they thought represented themselves, which weren't the photographs I would choose. And now I really love getting other people's perspective on what I'm doing because they see things in a completely different way to the way that I do. And that's been very, very interesting for me. It's very interesting to have these outside voices and to be open to them. So, and the second, I think you might have to remind me of what the second question was.
Someone else is going to. It was just that if you're aware that there might be an archive that might be found of yours in the future, would that affect the way that you were working now? Whereas before you might, you know, being a woman and being a photographer wouldn't exist. You might not even think anybody's ever going to see it.
Well, I absolutely loved what Karen said about working as a practitioner, and how if you are trying to archive your work, it takes up time where you want to actually be working, and that it becomes almost an impossibility, you know. So I absolutely loved it when Karen said that because for me, my loft is full of all of my work, as is my study, full of piles of boxes of stuff. And in fact, my sister-in-law, when she came round and saw my study for the first time, said, "Oh, you're like those people on the television." And she meant hoarders. And I was horrified. And I said, "But this is all my photographs and negatives and slides. And, you know, this is work, you know." And so in terms of sort of the work, I don't think I could really call it an archive in terms of any managed sense, but it is there as work. You know, it is all there. But in terms of the internet, I mean, I have to say I've been surprised by not the images I put up being out there, but images other people seem to have put up, you know, that suddenly are there. And so I think the internet, I mean, I don't know if it really bothers me in the sense that I suppose if I'm putting things out there, if somebody else is putting images up there, they must have got them from me in some way. I've put them out there in some sense first, I would say.
Sarah, we've got 4 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's great to hear you, as always, but we've got 4 minutes, and I just thought...
Carry on, no more questions.
Well, okay, one tiny question.
I don't know if we all do have a voice. I'm going to just problematise that for a minute.
Thank you.
Jean,
Yeah.
Yeah, wait for the mic.
Yeah.
We've got 3 minutes now.
I don't think that we all have a voice. I think the assumption that people do have a voice is something that has to come from the person saying it. In this discussion, in this whole symposium, there are voices that aren't being heard, and there are gaps. Yes. And I think it's fantastic this is happening. I think there's a hierarchy in terms of the way it's being presented, which fits into a certain remit about how we present papers, how we include people in discussions, and who of all the people here feel they can really say something that sounds clever or sensible or considered. I just wanted to put that out and say we also need to look at the number of women that are working in mobile photography, photography that's paparazzi, say, in the past, that aren't being included in this because we're still putting it through a certain filter about what we consider. And press photographers, now, with hindsight, it's being seen a certain way. I just want to just bring out that and just leave that as an open question about the gaps and the spaces and who feels they do have the voices. And it's not literally the speaking of it that represents it.
That's a great point.
I think fantastic point. Absolutely.
One really tiny one from Michael Ann. We've got 2 minutes now.
And I really wanted to respond to that thing. That's the, in a way,
go on then.
but I won't. But carry on. I won't.
Really quickly, Jean.
No,
And then
it's
we'll
all
have
right.
Michael
I
Ann.
mean, yes, you're absolutely right. And I you know, it's an issue, isn't it, for anybody who's archiving anything, or you really want to capture everything. I find myself being like Andy Warhol. You know, he did 4,000 recordings. I haven't got that many, but I found, yes, I want, oh, there's another one, you know. So it's very difficult. There is a hierarchy, and how do we solve that?
I just want to bring it up. This is what this is supposed to be about. And it has to be, the gaps have to be addressed because they are probably the most interesting sometimes.
I just wanted...
Michael Ann, last question.
I wanted to just ask one question about how you're dealing, how one deals with an archive like the Joe Spence. The Joe Spence archive, which you say is so problematic. And I wondered, because of being involved in it in some ways, who should have the last word in relation to the material in that archive? Is it in terms of context of the work, in terms of information about the work? Because you're dealing with two layers, aren't you? Mm-hmm. With Joe's work, and then with Terry's overlay on that work.
That's a good question. A good question. I'm not sure I know how to answer of who has the last word. I am still going through. There's still about 20 banker's boxes of unprocessed material. So I'm plowing through. I actually love the chaos. So to go back to the comment over here, I think that's why I am the one on my team who's dealing with the Bernie Sabat ephemera and the Joe Spence archive, because I absolutely love it. Because there are those treasures. But who gets the final word? I don't think it's any one person. I mean, I'm connecting with, I see Maggie Murray up there. I see Sarah Green. I can see all these people that were collaborators with Joe. And so I'm not looking to have any final voice, but I almost would be happy to have records just be fluid all the time and be just adding notes to it all the time. Because the stuff, there are certain photographs that appeared on this panel, and then we're in that exhibition, we're in this show, and it's so more about the ideas in the work. So for me, being on the real practical side of going through the material and trying to generate an archive tree that represents something, I'm really open to the records being fluid and changing certain series in the archive to reflect something different that is brought to my attention later down the road. So I don't see the thing as being a final answer ever.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for a great first day.